New York, 1919. Every year, 1 million new arrivals came from all over Europe, from Russia, from the Scandinavian countries, from Greece and Yugoslavia and Italy. They came because they'd heard that the United States was a land of opportunity, where they'd be free to work and to earn a good livelihood for themselves and their families. Many were soon disappointed, especially those who got no further than the overcrowded tenements of the East Side in New York. By the beginning of the 1920s, the United States of America was already the world's largest industrial power. Here in the northeastern states, people earned their living from iron and steel. Across the Middle West stretched the prairies. Good farmland producing an abundance of grain. Down in the southern states, blacks still did the heavy manual work, as they'd always done since the days of slavery. In 1919, Americans welcomed back their troops who'd helped to beat the Germans over there in Europe. President Woodrow Wilson returned from the peace conferences, eager to win his people's approval of the Versailles Treaty. He wanted America to join with European and other nations into a great league of nations to avoid future war. The president set out to speak to the people in towns and cities all over the USA and seek their support for his policy. But Wilson was never a robust man. He was living on his nerves, and he broke down under the strain of the tour. Wilson's dream that America would become a member of the League of Nations was never realized. America wanted isolation from Europe. The president ended his term of office as an invalid. The American Congress rejected membership of the League of Nations. America desired no part in the affairs of Europe. In the early 20s, a wave of strikes and demonstrations threatened to disturb the public peace. Many Americans were convinced that communists and anarchists were plotting a revolution in America. These two Italian Americans, Sacco and Vanzetti, were arrested in 1920 on slender evidence for robbery and manslaughter. However, they were known to be anarchists, and the jury found them guilty. Both men were sentenced to the electric chair. In this atmosphere of violence and tension, thousands of newcomers, most of them blameless, were forced to leave the country. Warren Harding became president in 1920. He promised to put America first. Harding had owned a newspaper in the small town of Marion, Ohio. The thinking of American small towns had always exerted a great influence on American politicians. It was pressure from the small towns, especially from the women, that brought in the famous 18th Amendment to the American Constitution, prohibition of the selling and buying of alcoholic drink. The saloon is well named the Poor Man's Club. It keeps its members and their families always poor. If you believe that the traffic in alcohol does more harm than good, help stop it. Close the saloons. Prohibition posters set out to convince Americans that sin, like gin, could be poured away. In spite of Prohibition, for many Americans, the good times were beginning. The country already had more cars than the rest of the world put together, and the motor car came to be the symbol of fast-growing industry. The owner of a family car not only gained respect in the eyes of his neighbors, he also found a new source of pleasure and adventure for the whole family. Americans began to discover what lay beyond their own backyards. Warren Harding was never a hard-working president. Most of all, he enjoyed relaxing with his old cronies from Ohio. Many members of this Ohio gang now held office in government departments. By 1923, there were widespread stories of corruption in Washington. Albert Fall, a personal friend of the president, was found guilty of selling government land at Teapot Dome, Wyoming. He'd sold it to oil companies in return for money to pay his own arrears of tax. Other cronies of the president were accused of graft, and some were jailed, though Harding himself was never accused. On a trip to Alaska in 1923, the president collapsed and died. Calvin Coolidge, the vice president, took over at the White House. Coolidge was an honest, homespun president. The business of America, he said, is business, and he saw every reason to protect American business from foreign competition. So America put high tariffs or taxes on all goods coming from abroad. And in reply, foreign countries raised their tariffs against American goods, depriving America of much of its overseas trade. Still, as long as Americans had the money to buy goods at home, all would be well. Wages were certainly good. Car maker Henry Ford was paying $5 a day. Excellent for that time. Get myself a job. I'm tired of laying around here, working on this starvation farm. The motor car industry was by far the largest in the country, and it stimulated other trades too: rubber, glass, steel. Henry Ford's Detroit factories, with their acres of assembly lines, poured out Model T Fords at the astonishing rate of 1 every 3 minutes. The 20s were the years of growth and boom in all consumer industries. This was the era of mass production, of new gadgets and new fashions. Radios, refrigerators, electric cleaners, washing machines, telephones, typewriters. And it was the era of the skyscrapers, mushrooming to house giant and expanding businesses. The American public was being pressurized to spend more and more in the shops.
There she is, there's what keeps me up at night. Oh, gee whiz, there's why I can't eat a bite. Those flaming eyes, that flaming youth. Oh, mister.
The 20s was the great age of silent movies, as cinemas replaced music halls and theaters.
See her coming down the street. Now I ask you very confidentially, ain't she sweet?
And it was the golden age of comedy and the slapstick antics of Harold Lloyd. Cecil B. DeMille's 10 Commandments was a typically lavish spectacular of these years. Commercial advertisers were quick to use the new medium of cinema.
But I must repeat, I must. Don't you think he's kind of mean? But you must tell me very confidentially, ain't she sweet? Ain't she sweet? See her coming down.
Radio programs put out regular commercials to reach people in their own houses, and salesmen called to demonstrate their wares.
Ain't she nice? Look her over once or twice. Now I ask you very confidentially, ain't she nice?
Advertisers were constantly trying to persuade people to buy more by flooding them with advertisements in magazines, on billboards, in newspapers and mail-order catalogues.
I repeat, don't you think she's kind of neat? And I ask you very confidentially, ain't she sweet? Oh, dear.
But it was pointless for advertisers to appeal to those people who could scarcely afford to fill the hungry mouths of their families, let alone buy radios, telephones or motor cars. The poor tenant farmers or sharecroppers of the Middle West and Deep South were caught up in a vicious circle of high rents, low prices for their crops, and a lack of machinery. There were thousands of evictions. Poor people were being forced to leave the land and set off to find work out west or up north in the industrial cities. Blacks continued to be at the bottom of the heap. The black had made little or no progress up the social scale since slavery had ended in 1865. In the South and Midwest, the sinister Ku Klux Klan was still putting fear into people's hearts. They spread hate against blacks, Jews, Catholics, and foreigners. The KKK were making sure no outsider would threaten their property or livelihoods. Grain poured from the American prairies, but prices were disastrously low. Yet their own high tariffs stopped foreign governments from buying American produce. Evicted farmers, unemployed men of all kinds, roamed across the country. These were the hobos, the traveling men, hitching free rides on the railroads, searching for seasonal work and returning to spend winter in the cities. There were still urban workers like miners and craftsmen, fathers of families, who were in unstable employment or sweated for low wages. Many faced squalor and poverty. Prohibition of the sale of alcohol was one of the most abused laws in American history. Bars and saloons were now illegal, but speakeasies or drinking clubs sprang up everywhere. Federal agents confiscated what liquor they found, but because these agents were badly paid, they could easily be bribed by gangsters, who thrived on prohibition. Gangsters organized the illegal alcohol business on a large scale. Their underlings were sometimes arrested, but never the big bosses. Al Capone, the Chicago gangster, did more than $60 million worth of business in alcohol in the year 1927. Chicago was Capone's manor. In Chicago, it was the gangster boss who paid and controlled the officials in City Hall. As 1929 approached, businesses were still booming. There seemed to be more luxury and more spending than ever. The whole nation seemed to be Wall Street crazy. Everybody was buying on credit, even stocks and shares. Small grocers and shoeshine boys bid for company shares and bought them from pavement stockbrokers on hire purchase for a few dollars down. Everything was on credit, and everyone lived on the profits someone else was expected to make. The Jazz Age saw great changes in the social habits of young Americans. They had cars and they visited dance halls and nightclubs where the music of ragtime and jazz gave black musicians an escape route from poverty. It was the age of crazes. Dances like the Charleston and the Black Bottom swept the country. There were few danger signs. People could see no reason why the stock market shouldn't go on producing higher and higher share prices and more profits for the shareholders. But their confidence collapsed on the day that several companies went bankrupt, the 24th of October, 1929. Panic set in, and people started to sell their stocks and shares for whatever price they could get. Nearly 13 million shares changed hands that first day, but in the days that followed, prices plummeted to rock bottom. Herbert Hoover, elected president in 1928, tried to restore people's confidence, but the crisis was impossible to check. Rich men lost vast fortunes overnight, and millions of small investors were left with nothing. Shops, companies, whole industries began to go out of business. Millions were soon to lose even their jobs. The boom was over. The Depression had come. Its shock waves not only rocked the foundations of the American economy, they were to be felt around the world.
They used to tell me I was building a dream, and so I followed the mob. When there was earth to plow or guns to bear, I was always there, right on the job. They used to tell me I was building a dream, with peace and glory ahead. Why should I be standing in line, just waiting for bread? Once I built a railroad, I made it run, made it race against time. Once I built a railroad, now it's done. Brother, can you spare a dime? Once I built a tower up to the sun, brick and rivet and lime. Once I built a tower, now it's done. Brother, can you spare a dime? Once in khaki suit, ah, gee, we looked swell, full of that Yankee doodly-dum. 500,000 boots went slugging through hell, and I was the kid with a drum. Oh, say, don't you remember, they called me Al. Hey, don't you remember, I'm your pal.